Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. This is a policy event, which is part of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics Summer Forum, which is in its second year. The chair of this event was Antonio Ciccone. He couldn't make it for some family emergency, and I had to chip in, so I'm going to be very brief. Today's topic, we discuss, every year when we have the summer forum, we discuss, what kind of policy event we can do. In Spain in general, and maybe in Spain in particular and Europe in general, I think there is need for pushing, policy evaluation, making policymakers accountable for their actions, and to push that idea, we thought maybe a policy forum or policy discussion on policy evaluation and, what kind of policies we can think about. And we thought, okay, two big issues are migration and education for many countries, not just for Spain. And we were lucky to have a very nice panel. So idea is, each panel member will have a short presentation, about 15-20 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. We have three speakers today. We will start with George Borjas, who is a professor of economics and social policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. I don't think he needs an introduction. We have Caterina Calsamiglia. George's presentation will be followed by one by Caterina, who will talk about school choice. I think George's presentation will focus more on immigration, and in particular cost and benefits of high-skill immigration. Caterina will talk about school choice, both, I guess, from a theory and practical point of view. Caterina is Associate Professor of Economics at Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and an affiliated professor of Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. And then we will end with Victor Lavy, who is a professor of economics at University of Warwick and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who also has a long history of being an advisor to governments and international organizations. So I want to make two observations. I just did quick Google search before coming. So Spain has an amazing experience with immigration. So in 1990, I look at the numbers, the immigrant population was about, less than 1%. So in 2010, 2014, this was about 14%. So huge increase in a very short period of time. In 2005, Spain was the second country in the world after US in terms of the absolute number of immigrants entering to a country. This is really an amazing transformation, and I think I am one of those statistics in 2005. So I was taken by that number, and it's quite impressive how the society react to immigration. I think in Spain there is overall a very positive attitude, and despite the big crisis, you don't see people on the street shouting, immigrants go home. I think I was very also positively taken by all this experience. And then about the education, maybe the experience of Spain is not that encouraging. Spain among 68 countries in OECD's PISA rankings. PISA is this test that they do across countries in math and other subjects. Spain is just below the average for years, despite the fact that the expenditure has been increased by 35% and several reforms. And that, I guess, one of these things that in economics we all agree that education is very important, but we know very little about the black box, what works and what doesn't. And after these short observations, I leave the floor to George.
Okay, thank you so much. As all of you know, most, if not all, immigrant-receiving countries seem to have a desire to admit more highly educated immigrants or more highly skilled immigrants, And in fact, you can sort of view the debate in immigration policy across much of the developed world as a competition among countries, among immigrant-receiving countries, for attracting high-skilled immigrants. Every immigrant-receiving country wants to attract more highly educated immigrants, more highly skilled immigrants. And even though, if you don't think about it very deeply, that seems like an obvious thing that an immigrant-receiving country should want, it's actually far from obvious why exactly most developed immigrant-receiving countries want more highly skilled immigrants. After all, most of Europe or the US or Japan or the immigrant-receiving Australia, New Zealand, they are very highly skilled countries to begin with. There's a lot of college graduates and post-college graduates in those countries, and you would think that if the gains from immigration come from admitting people who complement the people already there, more highly skilled workers don't really need more highly skilled workers. They need low-skilled workers to do the jobs that they are way overqualified to do. So the question of what exactly motivates the gains from high-skilled immigration is something that really hasn't been looked at very deeply, and the literature has only really begun in the last few years to sort of consider why it is that high-skilled immigration could be beneficial, when in fact what these countries really lack is a lot of low-skilled labor. So what I want to do today in 15, 20 minutes is sort of summarize for you the basic arguments, present to you sort of the new empirical work that's being done on what the potential gains from highly educated immigrants could be, and leave you with some thought, from some food for thought after that. So let me start by sort of repeating what I was saying before, and the potential gains from high school immigration really have to deal with what we call capital skill complementarities. In fact, when high school immigrants come in, they increase the productivity of resources that are complementary with them. And native-owned capital, if there are indeed capital complementarities, will be a main beneficiary of high school immigration. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that tends to drive a lot of the argument for high school immigration. But I'm going to argue in a couple of minutes that really cannot be the only argument. What's really at the core of the demand for high school immigrants is sort of the idea that there are what we call human capital externalities or spillover, productivity spillover effects from having very smart people around you. If you admit a lot of high school immigrants, the presumption is that some of that smartness will rub off on the people already there, make people more productive, and that could increase the gain from high school immigration. And last but not least, there's also fiscal impact of high school immigration. High school immigrants will tend to obviously earn more, have more taxes, demand fewer services, and that could lead to a fiscal gain. I'm going to ignore that sort of obvious point in what follows. I'm going to concentrate on the productivity impact of highly educated immigration or high school immigration. Now, there's also costs associated with this. And the costs have to do with the fact that if you let a lot of high school immigrants into the country, high school workers already in the country are going to experience more competition. That additional competition will tend to lower the earnings of high school workers, which will make being a high school worker actually less desirable. And you can imagine that if you let many, many, many high-tech engineers into a country, people don't really want to do high-tech engineering much more because the rewards of being a high-tech engineer goes down. And if you want to use a phrase that's sort of very commonly used in the US, there could be high-tech jobs or high-skilled jobs that become the kinds of jobs that natives don't want to do. And is that a good outcome in some sense? Now let me show you the experience of two different countries with respect to education and immigration. One is the US, where this graph sort of shows you what the immigrant share in the US has been, and by that I mean what fraction of the workforce, in particular education groups, is foreign-born. And as you can see in the US, the biggest increase has not been among high-skilled workers. The biggest increase has been among low-skilled workers. Between 1980 and the year 2000, for example, in 1980, something like 10% of high school dropouts, people who have less than 12 years of schooling, was foreign-born. By the year 2000, it's over 40%. Now, the next biggest increase is among the people with postgraduate degrees. So in the US, what's been happening over the last 30, 40, 50 years is sort of an increase in immigration at the tails of the skill distribution. We get a lot of high school immigrants at the very top of the education distribution, but we get even more low-skill immigrants at the very bottom of the education distribution. Another country to contrast is Canada, which is very, very different. Canada has, since the 1960s, pursued an immigration policy that specifically seeks out and selects highly educated immigrants. And as you can see in Canada, the biggest share of the workforce among for foreign-born people is among postgraduate degrees, something like 40%. Sort of the reverse, the mirror image of the US of people in Canada with a postgraduate degree are foreign-born. So these two countries have clearly pursued very different type of policies. In the Canadian case, specifically trying to attract high-skilled immigrants. In the US case, where skill filters are almost non-existent, the policy we have, which is one of family preference, has led to one in which we are basically attracting a lot of low-skill immigrants. And what we want to know is, well, what happens as a result of all this? There have been many studies in economics trying to estimate, or simulate is a better word actually, trying to simulate the gains from immigration into a country like the US, for example, and that's the data I'm going to present. In a country like the US, where the immigrant share right now is around 15%. Put in other words, 15% of the US workforce is foreign-born. Basically, if in the simplest model possible, with homogeneous labor, before we worry about skills, that 15% increase in the workforce due to immigration really remarkably leads to a very small gain on net for natives, something around $35 billion. Now, I realize $35 billion is a big number, and if I had that kind of money, believe me, I would be in Hawaii right now at a condo by the beach, but I'm not, so I'm here. But in the context of the US economy, a $35 billion gain is actually very, very tiny, because we have a $15 trillion GDP. So $35 billion gain when you admit 15% more people is really not that big a deal, economically speaking. But nevertheless, what we can show is that those gains would be greater in the short run if immigrants were more skilled. And the reason I mentioned before was because immigrants increase the productivity of capital. Natives in the US own a lot of capital, and the rate of return to capital would go up, and skilled immigration would make that rate of return much greater because of capital and skills are complementary, and that could lead to a much bigger gain. But unfortunately, those gains due to capital skill complementarity would tend to disappear in the long run. And the reason is that when immigrants come into a country and they increase the return to capital, that means that capital flows will go into the US from abroad, from within, and those capital flows will increase the stock of capital, which means that in the end, the returns to capital go back down to some normal level. So the gains from immigration, the gains from high-skill immigration cannot really be due to this kind of complementarity between capital and skills. The gains from high-skill immigration have to come from something completely different. And the something completely different, which is basically an extension of the traditional textbook model of supply and demand, deal with what we call human capital externalities. The presumption that having a lot of high-skilled workers around makes everybody else more productive, just because ideas tend to spill over and increase the productivity of everyone around, is sort of the core of the models of economic growth that have dominated the economic literature over the last 10, 20 years. So increase in the supply of high-skilled workers, whether due to more training or due to the admission of high-skilled immigrants, highly educated immigrants, that is the kind of productivity effect that is permanent. If you can let a lot of smart people into a particular labor market, that smartness spills over to everybody else. And that's a permanent increase in productivity. And that permanent increase in productivity could lead to very large productivity gains for the receiving economy. And that is where the gains from high-skill immigration will come in, if that spillover is really true or not. So what we have done in the last 10 years in economics is devote a lot of time and effort to empirically determine whether such spillovers are in fact important. And even before that, whether such spillovers even exist. I mean, they sound very nice conceptually, but the question is, do such spillovers exist? And the data is not, even though there's evidence one way, there's also evidence that doesn't completely conform to the hypothesis. So the data don't really provide a resounding confirmation of this kind of idea. And what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the empirical work people have done to sort of show you the way people think about this. And a lot of the data looks at particular empirical, case studies. That's a better way of putting it. And a set of case studies look at Germany and the impact of migration from Germany after the Nazis took over in Germany in 1932. One of the very first things the Nazis did when they took over in 1932 was literally to fire all Jewish scientists, or Jewish professors actually, from German universities. Those people included people like Albert Einstein, for example, or John von Neumann, a famous mathematician. Most of those scientists ended up in the US, and a set of studies look at what happened to German science and German productivity in scientific product as a result of those firings, and what happened in the US as well as a result of the firings. So in that slide, I sort of summarized a few of the studies that have been done along these lines. And what you tend to find is that in the universities that were more or less emptied out of these Jewish luminaries in the early 1930s, the students left behind suffered dramatically. You know, they were being mentored by really world-class scientists, and when those world-class scientists left, the productivity of the students left behind didn't really suffer dramatically. But on the other hand, the productivity of the colleagues left behind didn't really change all that much. So that's sort of a little signal of what spillovers do. When you're working with a luminary and that luminary leaves, you're worse off. But when you're just around that person, it's not really clear what the impact is. In fact, in that German context, the impact was zero. So it seems as if the distance between the quote-unquote immigrant and the person who's being affected by the immigration really matters a lot. The closer the distance, the more you gain. If they are around, the further the distance, the less it matters to you. A more recent study along the same line looks at what happened in the US as a result of this. And in the US, what the arrival of Einstein and von Neumann did was basically to attract many people into those fields. And that attraction led to a huge increase in productivity for the US. Remarkably, you don't see productivity increasing for the pre-existing scientists. It's only for the new people coming in, being mentored and being taught by this by the Jewish luminaries that had an increase in productivity. Now, that's one set of studies. Another set of studies I'll go over quickly deals with Soviet mathematics. This is a set of studies that I've been involved in. My co-author and I have a set of papers looking at what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. And about 1,000 world-class mathematicians left the Soviet Union, the main bulk of them going to the United States. Now, an important reason to study this is that Soviet mathematics and Western mathematics were really quite isolated from each other for over 70 years. Because of the political conditions of the Soviet Union, most Soviet mathematicians could not interact with Western mathematicians for over 7 decades. And as a result of that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, not only were people able to leave and look for jobs in the US, but all kinds of theorems and ideas that the Soviets knew and that the Americans didn't know about also made an entry. So it's an influx of ideas and of people. And the question is, what happened to the United States when not only do you get roughly a few hundred Soviet mathematicians coming in, competing for jobs, but you get this flood of ideas that could increase productivity among people already there. And the reason this is important is because in the Soviet Union, as I said before, they were very isolated. And the things that the Soviets studied were very different from the things the Americans studied, or the Western mathematicians studied. And just to give an example, in the US, the top two fields were statistics and operations research. They accounted for something like 15% of the papers published by mathematicians in the US. In the Soviet Union, those two fields are non-existent. Instead, they study partial differential equations and ordinary differential equations. So it's the way of seeing this is like what the Iron Curtain did is like putting people who speak English in different islands for 70 years and then reunite them 70 years later. Well, they still speak English, but it's a little different. It's the same thing happened with mathematics. They're still mathematicians, but they were interested in different topics. So the question is, what happens to the US when all these people come in who know a lot about differential equations? Does it improve the productivity of people already there or not? And what happened was that the New York Times actually has a couple of famous articles on this back in 1990. And this is the hypothesis, basically. This is a New York Times article written at the time all this was happening. And what it's saying basically is this American mathematician at Harvard, he's been trying to prove some theorems basically for years. And nobody knows how to help him. All of a sudden, these Soviet mathematicians know how to do it because they've been working on this for years. And this guy was able to become very, very productive as a result of this. That's the spillover effect. That's the gain from high school immigration. At the same time, another New York Times article looks at what's happening in the labor market. And what's been happening is that Soviet scientists, Soviet mathematicians, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, want to get a job in an American university. And they're flying all over the country to get jobs. Much more competition for jobs. And that's the other side of the coin. So not only do you get an influx that increases productivity, but you get much more competition in the labor market that makes it hard to hold a job in an academic research setting. And you can actually see what happened by looking at this graph. You look at the bottom line, the red line, that's the unemployment rate of mathematicians around 1990. This is data collected by the American Mathematical Society. And everybody knew at the time that the Soviets were really dramatically increasing unemployment for American mathematicians. Even though they brought in all kinds of ideas, they were at the same time bringing in an increase in the size of the workforce that led to a lot more competition. I just summarized what happened to productivity. The top line, the red dots there, is basically telling you what happened to the productivity of American mathematicians who did differential equations, basically. In other words, they were now coming in and they were being competed. They were now being exposed to new ideas that they didn't know before, but also they were competing in the same labor market. Those mathematicians lost out quite a bit. And that's basically the result that you see from the Soviet mathematician case. So as I was saying before, it's not really clear what the net impact is of immigration. More likely than not, let me just skip to the conclusion, more likely than not, what's happening is that whether you benefit or not from high school immigration depends on how closely connected you are to the high school immigrants. If you're able to collaborate, if you're able to be helped directly by these very high school workers, more likely than not you're going to gain dramatically. Because you can now prove theorems that you weren't able to prove before. But if you're sort of in the same field a little further away, there's a lot more people competing for these kinds of high school jobs. So the distance really matters quite a bit. One big caveat is that all these case studies that people are looking at in economics right now involve high school immigration defined in an extreme sort of way. You know, the Jewish luminaries that left Nazi Germany, or the few hundred Soviet mathematicians who were very high, world-class mathematicians coming into the labor market in the United States. When you talk about high school immigration, That, in general, that's quite different than talking about these kinds of people. These kinds of people are world-class scientists. When we talk about importing 10,000 more software engineers from India or China, that's a different ballpark altogether. And it's far from clear that the results we're getting in economics now regarding these case studies are really generalizable to the kinds of high-skill immigration policy changes that any given country could pursue. I'll end up with that. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the very inspirational talk. Now we will shift from immigration. Well, your talk was already, in some sense, very related to education, but now we will move to education. First, Caterina will talk about school choice, and then Victor, I guess, will talk more about what is in the black box of education.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity for me. I'm going to talk about a very narrow, but you'll see that I'll spend 20 minutes talking about it. So there's narrow, but then relevant and where details matter. So I think it's nice to explain to you why maybe researchers are needed so that they can spend some time doing these things, and then policymakers can just extract what we learn from research, okay? So this is I'm going to be using work that I've done with several people. So Chao Fu from Madison, Maya Wade from Edinburgh, Antonio Miralles from Autónoma with me, and Francisco Martinez Mora from Leicester. There's a bit of theory, there's a bit of data, there's a lot of policy insights, okay? So school choice is one of the most debated policies in education in the last decades. There's 2/3 of OECD countries that have expanded choice in one way or another. So in the past, children were simply put to their neighborhood school, which was potentially a good idea, very convenient for the parents. It creates this atmosphere in the neighborhoods and so on and so forth. But over the years, it has been raising some equity concerns. Well, why is that? Well, if schools start being heterogeneous and parents start being heterogeneous and preferences for schools are heterogeneous as well, if you link the school to residence and people can choose where they live, actually the fact that you link the school to the neighborhood may induce some segregation between neighborhoods, okay? And what ends up happening is that the housing prices basically reflect part of the benefits of school, the value of school quality, okay? So at the end, housing market ends up behaving as a filter or a price mechanism to access schools, which was not the initial goal of public education, okay? So why school choice? Why is it an interesting idea? What are the main arguments for it? Well, one is equity, the one I was just mentioning now. You want to make choice independent of income. That's why you want to have public education. You think education should be available to everybody, so should access to any of the schools, okay? So more choice, if you just allow for choice, that's going to mean, so you'll see here that here choice, I will always be referring to public choice, okay? So, choice within public schools, okay? So if you allow for choice, hopefully you're going to make it independent of income, okay? On the other hand, there's some studies showing that parents from disadvantaged backgrounds, they tend not to care as much, or they tend not to have as much information. So it may seem like if they're given an opportunity to choose, they may actually exploit it less. And so at the end, you're going to get even more cream skimming from this process, okay? But this is an open question, sort of. The other argument is that if you allow for school choice, you're going to get a better match between schools and children, and that should be good for basically schools and parents, and that should make the whole thing more productive. Okay, and on the other hand, if you allow people to choose, schools will have the incentive to attract students, and then that will induce some competition and some incentives for the schools to improve. Okay, so more and more studies have exploited the increased choice that I just mentioned in OECD countries to evaluate whether these things are actually true or not, okay? But now I'm going to focus on a very specific thing, which is When you say you allow for school choice, you basically say that parents' preferences should determine where the child goes to school. But what does that actually mean if school capacity is fixed? Okay, so I want to go to a certain school, but there's fixed capacity, and actually there's more families than seats available for a school. How do you actually, what do you mean by let people choose? Okay, you need to resolve these overdemands, and that's gonna turn out to be a quite problematic issue, okay? Which is the focus of my research in the last years, and which is what I want to transmit to you, okay? So in most cities, what the mechanism is, well, they said what the authorities decided to do is to ask parents to rank a list of schools, and then everybody's put in their first choice, okay? And if there's overdemand for a certain school, then you order applicants by following an order determined by priorities, and these priorities are given if your siblings are in the school already, or if you live in the neighborhood, or some other socioeconomic characteristics, okay? Those with higher priorities are accepted, and those who have lower priorities are rejected, okay? Now, the difference between the different mechanisms that we see worldwide, these different norms, relies on what happens to those who are rejected from their first choice, okay? And a particular solution to this is the Boston mechanism, which I'm going to call it B mechanism from now on, because it's also the Barcelona mechanism. So we're going to, it was named Boston because it was used in Boston, but we might as well just call it B mechanism from now on, okay? So the Boston mechanism does the following. Acceptances in the first round are permanent, meaning that if you're rejected from your first option and the algorithm tries to look for a seat for you in the second option, it's only going to consider you if that second school that you listed has free seats. Okay? So basically, desirable schools most likely are going to be filled up in the first round, and if you risk asking something that you really like, you may actually be left out with any options in some school that you could have had higher chances of getting into, okay? So in particular, if you like another school better than your neighborhood school and you risk applying for it in the second round, even though you have priority for it, you may not be able to access it because it's full already, even though you have points for it, okay? So this is the particular mechanism used here, and it's also used, it's the most widely used mechanism worldwide. And it's been acknowledged by Abdulkadiroglu and Senmitz that this mechanism is bad because it induces people not to reveal their true preferences, okay? So the actual list that you submit turns out to be a strategic game, okay? You have to think what other people will do, and that's an intricate thing, okay? In particular, you will probably want to exclude some of the top schools, okay? Some of your most preferred schools, the type of manipulation you're going to want to do is exclude some of the top schools. Now, is this bad? Well, maybe not. I mean, if I'm not going to be able to get into some school, excluding it, maybe if the allocation doesn't change, is not a problem. The problem is when you exclude schools that expose you could have accessed, okay? So what we try and see, so the mechanism, these people said, you know, this mechanism is induces strategic behavior, so that's bad, that's confusing for the parents. So we should change into another mechanism that doesn't have this problem, okay? So in some cities they did that, and I'll talk about that later. But I want to talk a bit more about this particular aspect, because it's different if it's just that some people exclude some schools that they will not have access than if they exclude anything that is unsafe, okay? So this is how, this is a picture of Barcelona entry at age 3. So this is the list that parents submit when their child is age 3, okay? And you see that 80, 88, 85, 89% of the families get their first choice, okay? And it's every year, it's in the newspapers. Everybody gets their first choice, so they're super happy, okay? But for most of them, it's the neighborhood school that they apply for, okay? There's two different readings of this. One is the newspaper reading, which is Barcelona is a great school. Parents' preferences are well satisfied, so everybody should be very happy. The other is safety is playing a huge role, right? People are just applying for the neighborhood school because they think that's the safe thing, and then in equilibrium, this works, yeah? So everybody gets their first choice, and that's it. Well, looking at this, you will never disentangle whether it's this or that, You cannot, right? Because you cannot know whether people like the school because it's close. I mean, the neighborhood school is very close, so it could be that everybody likes this school, right? You cannot disentangle the two. But in 2007, there was a policy change that helps us big time in identifying which one of the two it is. In particular, the priorities for schools were given, in the past, were given in the following way. The city was divided into 10 districts. All the schools in a given district were of highest priority for everybody in that district. Okay, so your neighborhood schools were all the schools in a given district. So that meant in particular that if you lived in the corner, you had schools very close by, but were in the other district that you did not have priority for. Okay? And some schools that were far off in the other side of the district that you did have priority for. Okay? So they said, well, that doesn't, if distance is the criteria, that doesn't make much sense. So what we'll do is basically make it distance-based. So you're going to have priority for the closest 6 schools. Okay? Great. Right? For me, it's amazing. Why? Because now I can look at behavior over time. And what I'm going to do is, so think of a family living here. Okay? Prior to the policy change, all this, the green and the red schools are the schools that they have highest priority for. Okay? After the policy change, this is the set of schools that they have highest priority for. Okay? So if preferences is what driving their choice, they should not, over time, they should basically, the fraction of families that are applying to each of these schools should be more or less the same. Okay, what we see that this is the case except for the year where there's this policy change. And in the year of the policy change, we see that people stop demanding these schools. Okay, so they stop demanding the schools that used to be in their neighborhood, but they're not anymore. And they start demanding the schools that are in their neighborhood now. Okay, so what does this say? Safety is a big concern. Okay, so families respond big time to priorities. Okay? Okay, what else? So there's some people that are still applying to schools that they don't have priority for. Okay, so they're taking some extra risks. And what end up happening to them is either they get none of the schools that they listed, and the list has 10 schools. Okay, or they enroll to private schools, okay? Which rings a bell for the following theoretical argument, which is if people have a private school, they're going to play a very different game in the public system. They can take higher risk because they know that if things don't work out, they can always go to private school. So even though there's only 4% of private schools in Barcelona, we see that actually 14% of those who don't get their first choice, they go to private school. Okay, so people do use this mechanism to play differently in Barcelona, okay? Okay, so it seems like these priorities play a huge role on what people demand, okay? So, and that can be rationalized if people are sufficiently risk averse, fine. Now, the alternative mechanism that has been suggested is this Gale-Shapley, and what this Gale-Shapley does is, if you don't get in your first choice, when you go to the second choice, independently of whether it's full or not, if you have more points than those that have been pre-accepted, you're first, okay? And you can kick out. So that means you can take risks of applying to anything, because if you don't get in, then in the second choice you can get in, okay? And this is truth-telling, means people can reveal their true preferences. Problem is it's not efficient, okay? And I'll tell you briefly why, okay? So suppose there's some schools that are, everybody thinks those schools are worse, okay? One of the things that happens with this mechanism is that everybody in the end, even though they submit their true preferences, at the end, they're still going to be allocated to their neighborhood school. And why is that? Well, why can it not be the case that Libertad and she lives in one good school, in the neighborhood of one good school, and I live in another neighborhood. She would like my school because it has more music. I like her school because it's arts, okay? And there's this bad neighborhood over there, okay, where those people there, they would like to go anywhere, either of the two schools. So why is it not the case that it would be efficient for me and her to trade seats in some sense, right? What happens though is for me to get her seat, she has to outbid everybody else in the put neighborhood, because if there's ties, if there's ties, they're resolved randomly. So if I'm competing for her seat, I have to compete against all the people from the poor neighborhood. And chances of me getting a higher number than all the people in the poor neighborhood, those chances are low. yeah? Not only that, not do I have to get her seat, but she needs to get mine. Because if she's not lucky to get mine, then I'm gonna ask, she's gonna claim back her seat and kick me out, okay? Bottom line is that the Gale-Shapley, if there's some schools that are worse, which happens, right, in cities, that some schools are believed to be worse, everybody at the end is still gonna be allocated to their neighborhood school, okay? This is the theory, okay? But this is a theoretical argument, but I'm gonna show you that it has some empirical relevance. Okay, there's a third mechanism which is called the top rating cycles that is very intuitive to economists because you basically assign everybody to some school in their neighborhood and then you allow for trades, okay? And the trades, the algorithm computes the trades for you. So you submit your true preferences and it's optimal for you to do that and they compute cycles of trades so that everybody is better off, okay? And that's an efficient mechanism. It's not only truth-telling, but it's efficient. So Boston is not truth-telling, and that means that it's painful for families to play because they have to be strategic and think about what they do, and that's going to affect where they can get to. Okay, the inefficiency there comes also from people not applying to schools that they could have accessed. Okay, and there's this other theoretical argument which says Boston also has something good, which is if there's two people and they both care equally about, they both have the same rankings, okay? But I care a lot more about the school one, okay? Who of the two is gonna be applying to? Me, because I care more about that school, okay? So the intensity of preference is not only the ranking, the intensity is gonna be reflected by the Boston mechanism, okay? Because only those, it's gonna induce like a self-selection argument. Only those who really care about the school apply for it, okay? And that allows you to get some cardinal information out of people, okay? So we have the Boston mechanism that has some problems but some potential benefits, and then we have the Gale-Shapley, which probably we don't like ex ante too much, and then there's the top rating cycle, which we don't like it ex ante too much, but it's the mechanism that has substituted the Boston in cities where it has been changed, so in particular England and Boston and other places, okay? Top rating cycles is the one that cycles. What do we do? I mean, is this good? Is the Boston good or bad? Is it better or worse than the TTC? I mean, what is the, we can't really say just like that. So what we do with Chao Fu and Maya Will is to estimate preferences. Okay, so we use the data from Barcelona, and actually we merged 5 data sets from Barcelona, thanks to IDESCAT, so amazing challenge and accomplishment in Catalonia. So we create this data set that includes a very rich set of observables, and we estimate preferences so that we can then see what would happen if we had different mechanisms. Okay, so we estimate the preferences and then we simulate the counterfactual. And what we do is we estimate preferences with 2006 data, which is prior to the policy change, and then we see whether we can predict the behavior of 2007 with those estimated preferences, and we can. So that's a good reality check. And then we see what would happen under the other mechanisms. And here's what we get. So this is, if we change from the Boston, which is the one that was in Boston, and we change it to Gale-Shapley, which is the mechanism that was used that has been changed to in Boston, we see that only 10% of the families benefit from this and 28% get hurt, okay? And those who, so this is just an average, you know, we put it in money terms because we have tuition and so on. But another important thing is that losers are those from poor neighborhoods. So this fact about if there's some schools that are worse, these people will never get out of their neighborhood because people will get stuck in their neighborhood. That's true also. We can see that holding in the data. Okay? So if you had to recommend, do you want to substitute the Boston mechanism by the Gale-Shapley, which is what everybody has done, the answer would be no. Okay? From Boston to top rating cycles, which is this more economics, you know, trade is good. So here we get that 20% get hurt, benefit and 20% get hurt, so it's more or less the same, but in terms of efficiency, we actually get an increase, okay? And it seems to be less sensible to neighborhoods, okay? So if you want to do some change, you should go to TTC and not to Gale Shapley. Okay? Conclusion. So the Boston mechanism forces families to apply to neighborhood school because it's safe, okay? And that's a source of inefficiency, but it also provides a chance for those who have a really bad neighborhood, they can just try out something because they have nothing to lose, okay? And that actually is a benefit that the Boston mechanism offers and the Gale Shapley doesn't. Because even if you get in the first choice, if you manage to get in the first round, chances are that you're gonna be kicked out in some future round by somebody who has priority for that school, okay? So, and the Boston mechanism provides better chances for those who have a private school. So that's bad, right? You don't want you don't want the private. So it's people who can pay a private school. They should go ahead and go to private school, but they should not have increased chances to the best schools in the public system. Okay. Gale Shapley allows families to state true preferences, but that's basically useless because they're going to be, at the end of the day, very much in the neighborhood anyways. Okay? And then TTC is best in terms of assigning children to school according to preferences. Okay? Now, by the way, the only city that has TTC is New Orleans. This is, and it's since 2012. So this is very much, yeah. I hope the future, but we'll see. So what this research questions a little bit is, first, that you need to be careful when you design these rules because they have huge impacts on where people go to school and on the equity of the system. And the other thing that comes into mind is these priorities, right? They have a huge role both in the Boston mechanism and in Gale Shapley, and they are not even questioned, okay? So why do we need to give priority to people from certain neighborhoods? Why not to people from poor neighborhoods overall so that they get to choose more? What is the objective underlying these priorities? We don't really know. If the objective is just to let parents choose and then a way to break ties, well, it's not clear that that's helping in any sense, right? So that's something that the policy debates should take care of, okay? I don't think we have much to say. Especially if these priorities can be bought, right? Because then you're back to segregation into neighborhoods, because if living somewhere gives you increased access to a school, then people will segregate into neighborhoods, okay? So I would remove them. I would remove the Boston mechanism, but I would also remove priorities. And then another thing is that there's a series of studies, and one in particular, Victor will mention it, that he's done in Israel, that look at the impact of this implementation using the Boston mechanism on outcomes. So the question is, they get positive results, so choice is good, but I wonder what they're getting at, because you're implementing choice, and the variation is only for a few people. So that's most probably an underestimate of what you could get if you actually implemented choice throughout. Yeah? So I think that's it.
So before I give the floor to Lavy, I just would like to mention one thing. Inspired by the big success of Scandinavian administrative data sets. In recent years, as Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, we have been talking with the statistical agencies in Catalonia to create and make administrative data available to researchers. I mean, otherwise we will all end up working on Denmark or Sweden. So we just want our own data. And Caterina has been very pivotal in this effort, as it's evident from her work. And the data in general and availability of this big data sets is really critical for the type of research that Caterina and others are doing. So,
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about what works in education. What I want to do in the 20 minutes that I have is take you to a bird view of the evidence that we have about economics of education and how relevant they are for policy. So present a shelf of options to policymakers in terms of designing educational intervention. This is, of course, non-comprehensive. It's a very small part of what has been done in economics of education in the last 2 decades. I will rely naturally more on some of my work, but I, of course, will mention others. On every topic, I will mention one or two studies, but I will give you the flavor of the evidence that we have. So economists, since the mid-1950s, already gather information about the importance of education for individuals. We call that evidence from micro-level studies. And we have learned that an additional years of schooling is worth a lot in the labor market in terms of earnings. The rate of return to an additional years of schooling was estimated all over the world in the last 50 years. And we have more or less robust evidence that it's about 7 to 10% per years of schooling. So take two individuals, one dropped high school after 10 years of schooling, another person dropped after 11, in Spain, for example. We expect the person who dropped a year later to earn between 7, 8, 9% more on monthly earnings than the one who dropped a year earlier. This is replicated all over the world. The rate of return varies a little bit, but this is more or less the picture. And schooling at the individual level has additional benefits. For example, improved health, lower crime. So we are quite confident in this field of economics, which is called labor economics, that education at the individual level is the best investment you can find in an economy. There is no other investment that will give you in real terms, lifetime, 7, 8, 9% year after year. So that's why we observe people investing in education and not dropping out after 2, 3 years of schooling. Oops. In recent years, so I would say the last 15 years, we also have evidence from the macro point of view about the importance of human capital, that education and schooling is part of it. And we have now studies that suggest that economic growth, variation in economic growth across nations, large part of this variation can be explained by human capital accumulation and the rate of human capital accumulation across countries. And there are some studies that document this important fact. So now we have basically micro-level evidence, macro-level evidence that education is very, very, very important. And policymakers in developed and developed countries have not unnoticed this fact. And if you combine this evidence together with the round of testing that became very popular all over the world, the PISA, the United Nations, other international organizations who run tests and compare students from different countries in terms of achievements, policymakers all over the world became aware of the importance in investing in education, and actually we see the share of GDP devoted to education increasing almost all over the world. So funding for education has gone up in Europe, OECD countries, East Asia, Latin America, everywhere. However, the micro evidence and the macro evidence do not tell us what can we do with this additional funding. Where should we put our marginal dollar, euro, pound in the education system? What should we expend? There's a lot of funds coming in. How should we use it in a way that will maximize the benefit out of this additional saving? This is the place where economics of education steps in. You can't imagine the dimension of transformation in terms of knowledge, know-how, that economics of education has produced in the last 20 years. Education is not a new field. We have decades and decades of research in education in other disciplines. Okay? But what economists have done in the last 20 years in terms of gathering information and knowledge about what works and what doesn't work in education is, I think, is unprecedented in terms of any fields that you can compare it to. So this transformation, this revolution in a way, had several components. One was in terms of methodology. You can find in economics of education the most rigorous methods in applied microeconomics. Microeconomics is an area that combines labor economics, health, education, public economics, environmental economics, family economics, etc. All those are under the umbrella of of applied microeconomics. Labor is the leading discipline in using empirical methodology in economics. And economics of education is subfield of labor economics. And you can see that this revolution is accompanied by using frontier methods, statistical methods, and also developing those methods for the purpose of studying in this area. So we accumulated body of evidence both from developed and for developing countries. Whatever I will present to you today will be concentrated on evidence from developed countries, just because lack of time, but we have a lot of evidence from poor countries, from East Asia, from Africa, and from Latin America. There are two bodies of evidence that constitute this new know-how since the early 1990s. One is called observational studies. We use data from real life, and we try to use it in order to say something with scientific value. So think about randomized experiment in the area of health or of medicine, pharmaceutical, etc. When you have a control group and a treated group, we try to mimic the strength of evidence that you obtain from a randomized experiment, but using field data, observational data. And there are a lot of issues to confront, and I mentioned here selection, endogeneity, etc., that actually limit the use of observational data for producing scientific evidence, but this area of labor economics and economics of education in particular, were able, researchers in this area, to find natural experiment, natural variation in exposure to different treatments, to different policy changes that allow us to address the causal relationship of interest. So we want to find out what's the effect of A on B, and we are able to use these methods in a very sophisticated way. There's also randomized experiments that are done. They're fewer because they're expensive and they require time, and they have some limitation in terms of the coverage, in terms of their external validity, for which population the evidence from randomized experiments are relevant. They don't address long-term effect, that usually do not allow to look at general equilibrium effect beyond the local context. But it is very useful to combine evidence both from observational studies and from randomized experiments. Without data, all this methodology revolution that I described to you could not have been implemented. And the evidence that I present to you are making use of very rich data, most comprehensive data sets in economics. There are some countries in the world that are leading in providing data for such analysis. Norway, Sweden, the US, Israel, a bit of England. Unfortunately, Spain is not one of them. France is becoming one of them. Italy is not included at all. So when you see the evidence that will produce, it will come mostly from these countries, the US, Israel, a bit of England, a bit of Northern Europe, okay? So this is the time to urge people in Spain who are in charge of gathering this type of data and holding it to allow access to researchers to use this data. So I'm going to focus now on one dimension of policy options available. I will talk about quality. Why? Because in most of the developed world, attainment in terms of completed years of schooling, we have reached basically almost 100% of attainment, definitely in primary school, in middle schools, and also in most countries beyond compulsory schooling towards completion of high school. So attainment is really not an issue. It is an issue in many developing countries, but I'm not going to talk about developing countries today. So I'm going to focus about school quality, okay? What am I going to tell you? I'm going to tell you how school quality can be improved by increasing existing inputs, very straightforward definitions: class size, teaching time, technology and computers, teachers' quality. Those are standardized traditional inputs that we are familiar with. And then we'll describe to you some evidence about new inputs, new direction in terms of technology of producing knowledge for students from first grade to the end of high school. Provided incentives to school systems, local authorities, incentives to schools, incentives to teachers, incentives to students, okay? And I will talk a little bit about charter schools. Then I will tell you a little bit about inputs that correct distortions. School choice for me is a distortion correction mechanism because people were not allowed to make a free choice, and that's a distortion in my world. And that's why I included here vouchers, information to parents, to students, etc. Then I will talk a little bit about scaling intervention and building a culture of scientific-based evidence for policymakers. So let's talk about how school quality matters for students. Does it matter whether students go for one school which is better than other? So let me just tell you that two studies that one of them was done by me and co-authors. We have looked at kids who were moved from Ethiopia to Israel at a very young age and were dispersed, randomly assigned to different schools in Israel that varied by locality, by quality. And we followed those students over 18 years until they reach age 18 to see whether the quality of the primary school they attended made a difference. Some went to very bad schools, some went to middle average schools, and others went to top schools in the country just by chance. And what we show is that really those who went to very good schools, who had to contribute value added to the knowledge of students, did very well after finishing high school. Actually, the quality of the schools allowed those students who were exposed to those better quality schools to close by almost 60% the gap between Ethiopians who just came from Africa, from rural, remote areas in Ethiopia, to native Israelis. That's a big, big improvement, closing about 2/3 of the gap. Another study that I'd like to mention is by Pop, Elches, and Orchiola from Columbia University. They look at a reform in Romania that allows students, again, to be allocated randomly to schools by school quality. This is about high school, and they also show that school quality matters a lot for outcomes. So we know that school quality is very important. But what is it about schools that make them better? How do we improve quality? What do we know about what to do in order to improve schools in part of Barcelona where we think the schools are not as good? Well, we know a little bit. We know much more than we knew 20 years ago, okay? So first of all, we know now that class size is very important. Up to 20 years ago, it was a very skeptical view about the importance of class size. The field of the discipline of education actually suggested that changing class size, reducing it, did not make a difference for student achievement. Well, we have now evidence that suggests that reducing class size leads to improved achievement. However, it's very expensive. It's very expensive because to reduce class size, you have to build new schools, to add physical structures, classes, and you need more teachers. So think about this reform in California in the early 1990s when the parliament in California, the Congress, the local Congress, legislated reduced class size. 4 or 5 years, researchers look at the data, and what was the result? Achievement went down in California. Class size went down by almost 50%, yet achievement went down. Why? Because the policy of reducing class size was accompanied by digging teachers from the low part of the barrel of teachers' quality. Teachers who already retired, teachers who were not good and were laid off from the system earlier on, were called back to the system. So we had a combination of reducing class size and lowering teachers' quality. And the combination was reduction in achievement. So it's not so simple to reduce class size. It's expensive, and you have to worry about the quality of teachers because there'll be teachers to be added to the system. But we know now, the data from Israel, the data from Sweden that I'm citing here, that if you hold constant, ceteris paribus, the quality of everything else, and you reduce class size by 20, 30, 40%, you will improve outcomes of students, learning outcomes in reading, in mathematics, and science. Teaching in a smaller class leads to improved achievement. A second thing that was neglected for a long time is how much time kids are spending in school. and research in economics of education now have addressed this issue. So you look at the European countries, and you see some countries that kids are spending over 1,000 days a year, 1,000 hours a year in school. You go to Finland, and they spend only 680 hours. You go to South Europe, and you see much lower time inputs in school, either in terms of number of days a year, number of hours a year, the length of the school week. Spain actually is in the middle of the European distribution of how many hours kids spend in school per week. Right? It varies in Europe from 20 hours a week to some countries when it's over 35. Does it matter? Say in Barcelona that we want to improve achievements. Should they teach more science and mathematics in terms of hours per week? Should they expose students to more teaching time in the classroom? Does it have a payoff? Is it cost benefit to do that? Well, we know now that it does. That adding an hour on the margin of teaching math or English or science will improve test scores. By how much? Not by much, but by a significant amount. So if you move from 2 hours or 3 hours a week to 5, 6 hours a week studying mathematics, you should expect about 0.2, 0.25 standard deviation improvements in test scores. Okay? So that's another option that we have on the table for policymakers to consider. Okay? And that will vary by context. In some places, the average class size will be 35, so definitely that should be reduced. In other contexts, students are going to school only 30 hours a week, and that should be increased. So really the options varies. One important thing that we have learned, that the productivity of an additional hours of instruction is not the same across countries in Europe. In some countries, adding an hour will add more than 0.05, 0.06 standard deviation, much more. What are the correlates of this productivity? Okay, I can tell you that systems that have adopted accountability measures, announcing the average achievements in a school, providing information about the quality of teachers, their qualifications, giving information about violence in schools, giving information publicly on the website about the quality of interaction between teachers and students. All those dimensions of accountability, in those setups, the marginal productivity of an additional hour of instruction is much higher than otherwise. Giving an autonomy to school. I know that unions are very important everywhere and in Spain as well. But giving autonomy to schools in terms of hiring teachers, not the city, not the central authority, but the school, determining who are the teachers that will teach in their schools. That is highly correlated with the value of marginal product of an hours of instruction, and it saves a lot of money. Giving an autonomy to schools in terms of using their budget. Giving a budget to school and allowing them to determine the parameters of spending, how they want to spend their money. That's also very important. Having a schooling board, a board of governors for every school that oversee the work of the headmaster and the teachers in the school. Having the community involved in the schools, the parents introduced into the boarding board of the school. All those dimensions of accountability and structure of a school are highly correlated, and in systems that those things are put in place, the value of marginal product is very important. I also state here what is not important, and you can read that. For the sake of short of time, I will move on. Non-teachers input. Let me just mention one, computers. That's a very sexy input. Everywhere, there is a tendency of spending a lot of money on computers. Even though this is a very expensive technology, it changes all the time. Computers are stolen from schools, they are broken, et cetera, et cetera. We have no evidence whatsoever in developed countries that having computers in schools improve learning outcomes. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have computers in school. It's just that we shouldn't think that that would be the solution for improving school quality. So from the data in Israel that I analyzed with the co-author in 2000 to data used in the US and in England, no evidence whatsoever, sound evidence, scientifically based evidence that computers are a magic word for learning outcomes. Teachers' quality. Does it matter? It does. Teachers are very important, and the quality is very important. And we have now a lot of evidence that suggests that not only learning outcomes are improved while you are in primary school or in high school with better teachers. Your wages down the road, and there's a series of studies by a researcher from Harvard called Raj Chetty and co-authors that use data from New York, from Boston, and shows that 10, 15 years after completing primary schools, the quality of your kindergarten teacher and the quality of your first and second and third grade teachers matter for how much your earnings are when you are an adult, okay? So on that, I think there is a consensus. But again, I asked the question, how do we measure school quality? How do we measure teachers' quality? There are no characteristics of teachers that systematically correlate with their quality. The type of schooling they have, whether they have an undergraduate degree or master's degree, whether they're young or old, whether they are married and have children or do not have children. All those characteristics do not provide systematic correlation with teachers' quality, okay? So there isn't really observable measures of teachers that we can put our finger on and say, you do this, you will improve teachers' quality, okay? So in this area, we are still looking for answers. So one answer, the study that I've done, again, with the co-author Josh Engers from MIT, that we provided on-the-job training to teachers. Most of the training for teachers are done in colleges, et cetera. We know now that much of the training that they get is irrelevant for how good they are in school, okay? In labor economics, we have this notion of on-the-job training, which is done by many, many firms and found to be very valuable. We implemented the same idea in schools and provided training to teachers. In the school, every Sunday, or in Israel it's Sunday because it's the first day of the week, about what they're going to teach throughout the week in a given subject. Okay, and we brought experts to the school and we went over the curriculum, and we did that for 3 years. And we found marvelous results. Okay, marvelous results. We've done it in the worst schools in Jerusalem, and we followed them for 3 years, and we showed how basically those kids who are living in deprived neighborhoods, attending deprived schools, have done much better with teachers who provide. So this is one dimension, on-the-job training to teachers instead of sending them to outside institutions to get training when they finish their schooling. Incentives. Okay, I'm going to move now and talk about modern interventions. Up to now, it was a classical thing, class size, hours, computers, teachers training. There are other things that I didn't mention, but we have evidence. Let me tell you about some exciting ideas in economics of education of how to improve schooling quality. Okay? We economists like incentives, mechanism of incentives, incentivizing agents so that they will do better given their objective function. Here in Spain, as almost anywhere in Europe, wages are determined by a collective bargaining agreement. Everybody is paid the same wage. Not only in schools, in primary and middle schools and high school, but also even in universities. A professor of history will get the same salary as a professor of economics, unfortunately. Now, we think that there is already evidence that suggests that opening this system and introducing differential wages for teachers is going to be beneficial. Okay? We've done some experiments. I've done experiments incentivizing schools with providing average incentives to the school and the teachers. I've done experiments with incentivizing individual teachers when they get bonus payments every year based on the outcomes of their students. There are evidence from India. There are evidence from Kenya. There are evidence from now Sweden and Norway that suggest that we should continue exploring this direction. We're not there yet in terms of providing the optimal scheme, but we know that it works. There are issues, of course, of worrying about the relationship between teachers in the schools, about manipulation that schools and teachers can do over time. Cheating, for example, is a concern. Teaching to the test, for example, is a concern. Let me tell you something about teaching to the test. So in those experiments that we did, people actually said, well, they have short-term goals. They are maximizing all kinds of methods and techniques so students will do better. You teach to the test. It's not real human capital. Well, we've done those experiments in the mid-1990s and in the early 2000s. So now we follow those students, and they are adult. They are 35 years old. So we look at their completed schooling, and we look at their wages. And what do we find? That the teaching to the testing that led to improved outcomes in primary school and high school is translated, or those gains are translated now to higher earnings, and the higher earnings is related to higher university post-secondary schooling at large. So I think that the concern about teaching to the test is a bit exaggerated, and the evidence that we show now for these teachers' incentive stuffs, plus on school choice and other mechanisms that may lead to improved outcome, are not really a concern. So this is the evidence from India. So I said, my summary about policy is that we should experiment more, okay? We're not ready to go and introduce system-wide tools of incentivizing teachers. We know how to do it more than we knew 10 years ago, but there are still things that we have to study, and I think what we should do is do more experiments before we go on. School choice, I'm not going to elaborate too much about school choice because we had a fantastic presentation by Caterina. Let me just tell you that my own point of view is that I don't worry very much about the Boston mechanism and the Shapley mechanism. I think, to be modest, they are irrelevant for policy making. I designed the school system in Tel Aviv in 1994, and I designed the school choice system for Jerusalem in 2003, okay? My answer to the mayor when he told me, what should we do if there will be oversubscribed schools and I cannot give to students their first choice? My answer to him was, put mobile homes in the schoolyard to absorb anyone who want to go to school J, and don't force him to go to another school. Next year, what you should do is build campuses. If there is a school that everybody wants to go to, make it a university with 2 campuses. Take the school principal, let him open another school, implement the same philosophy, so kids who want to go to that school, they should go to that school. Don't hold students prisoners of low-quality schools. Close schools. If a school is failing and no one wants to attend that school, close that school, okay? There is no reason to hold kids who come from deprived background to go to a deprived schools. Not only they suffer socially because their parents, who love them very much, but are less educated than others and have lower income than others, they suffer from growing in a family like that, even though it might be a very loving family. They have deprived access to human capital of parents. Don't deprive them from access to good schooling. So all these mechanisms are great. I don't care personally about them. Just open more classes in the schools that are highly demanded, and next year, duplicate schools, okay? Just as we do for any other product. If there's high demand for Coca-Cola, we don't force people to drink something else. We just produce more Coca-Cola. So we should do the same thing with schooling. School incentives, let me just skip that. Okay. I mean, all these things that I described to you, some of them are expensive and some of them are cheaper. Here is an intervention that is relatively cheaper. Provide information to students, parents, and schools, okay? Provide information about the value of schooling later in life. I mean, I said 7, 8, 9% rate of return. Why are people dropping out at age 16? If they can reap another 6, 7% for an additional year, why don't people complete 12 years of schooling? Why do we have dropouts? It doesn't make sense. It's a market failure. There's such high rate of return. One of the reasons is that kids do not have information about the value of education. And now we have evidence of some studies done in developed and developing countries where we know that providing information, especially information to kids from deprived background, that leads them to invest more in schooling. And that's really not costly. You don't need really an increase in budget to get kids to stay in school if you provide them the information about the value of an additional years of schooling. Not everybody will stay, but 10, 15% will stay. That's a great benefit to the system. Okay? So providing information, it's a great investment. So I summarize here the implications of some of the things that I said and some of the things that I didn't say. We have more results that are exciting produced by researchers in this area, and I'll be happy to share them with you in another opportunity. Let me just spend the last few minutes to talk about how to scale from experiments or from small policy results to the program, to a large program that covers the whole system, and talk about the culture of using scientific evidence for policy making, okay? I think we are far behind the optimal equilibrium in terms of using evidence for policy in the social sciences. I think no one of us will go into the hospital and be willing to go through an operation when he doesn't know really that that operation was tested, what are the outcomes, what should he expect. No one is taking a drug almost, a medicine, without it being approved by many government agencies after randomized experiment. Why do we agree to send our kids to school and let them be experimented with different interventions that were never tested, never actually studied? We never, I don't say we never care, but the authorities do not care about finding out beforehand what works and what doesn't work. What are the spillover effect, the externalities, the side effects, if you want. I mean, every medicine that we buy, it's written what are the side effects. Why don't we care about our children when we think about sending them to school and expose them to different programs? Anywhere in the world, authorities, educational authorities, are just implementing whatever they have in mind without really studying. So what I think we should do, and that's what I'm preaching in my country, in Israel, that we should move in the social sciences, in welfare programs, in health I mentioned, in educational program, in labor markets intervention. We should move much more to policy based on scientific evidence. Look, Spain, I had an interview this morning with a journalist, and I told her that Spain is experiencing an unemployment rate of 22% on average, and for the youth it's about 50%, and you've been struggling with it for years. And she asked me, what do you recommend? And I told her what I recommend, but I said, what I recommend for the Spanish government is to start running some policy experiments regarding how to solve unemployment. And a 2-year horizon is not very long. It's not very long. You won't even, close your eyes and you're there. The Clinton administration had their welfare reform in the mid-1990s, basically moving from cash transfer to conditional cash transfer in almost every program. You know what preceded that reform? 2-3 years of studies done by top researchers in economics and other related areas. And based on the evidence from those studies, the Clinton administration designed this huge reform of the welfare system in the US. So I think we should think about that direction as well and stop implementing policy and education in other related areas as well, but particularly in education, policies that were never tested and we don't know the consequences. We're actually taking money and throwing it away, okay? And throwing it away. And here I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. We have lots of graduate students in the audience. I'm expecting an increase in the number of students who will work on economics like education next year. So we will call it a Lavy effect. So floor is open for discussion. If there are any questions, comments, we are a little bit late in time, but I guess
The game starts at 9, so we already missed the 6 o'clock one.
so.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice talks. I wanted to ask Caterina, but it's very related to what Victor was mentioning. I wanted to know if from your data, can you say something about how well are making parents decisions about schools? So are they being driven by infrastructure more than about quality of teachers, or impossible to, oh, okay.
So we don't, we do have quality data, but we do not have any characteristics of the, I mean, we just have like the average test scores in these external evaluations that people have in the different schools, but we don't, and that explains part of, so people, from what we know, which is this aggregate measure of quality and then distance, basically people care about the quality and distance. This is the, and then of course they trade off. Priority has a huge impact, so they are not, but we don't have very rich data on teachers or anything, no.
So quality measured by standardized exams,
Yes.
or
Yes.
so there seems to be, because there are no rankings in Spain, no?
Right,
As far as
but
I know.
people
So I guess
seem
that-
to know.
to get- to gather information.
Yeah.
And so that a bit related to what Victor was saying. So I completely agree with having schools autonomy to deciding things, but also this must be brought together with good performance evaluation of schools and good information for parents, right? So I guess it cannot be done by itself.
No, definitely. No, I mean, I didn't mean that schools should just run on their own and do whatever they want. That there should be supervision and you know, reports, etc. But yeah, there should be some standardized tests or things that the school should achieve, basic curriculum, but that exists in many countries. But my worry is about the flexibility the schools have, because the technology of transferring know-how to students is not something that we can prescribe, you know, with the precision of 100%. It's not a manual that we use to produce a car, okay? And there is so much trade-off in terms of the teacher's attribute, his charisma, his self-confidence, how can he relate to students, how can he motivate them? And teachers have different dimensions of those attributes. And we don't know even how to build those attributes, how to promote them for different teachers. And that's why I think we should give schools more flexibility and teachers more flexibility, but holding them responsible for outcomes and consequences.
Following up on education, just giving some information, you were talking about the policies that should be somehow get some evidence and then implement the policies. Just for your information, in Spain, every single government that comes in makes a change in the legislation of education. Exactly. And you know, without even thinking about it, but it causes a lot of distress to the system. So it really is the opposite of what it should be done. My question is about the quality of teachers. There has been some talk here in our country about the possibility of being more selective in have higher requirements for entering students for learning how to be teacher, or for, you know, the selection of teachers. Do you think that this would have a real impact? Because you said, well, we really don't know what's behind it, right? So it's somehow it seemed that you were saying it depends very much on the person, the attitude, blah, blah, blah. But would some of, because now the entering exam for the studying for teacher is about the lowest we have in the system. So
that's
would
why,
that have an effect?
yeah, that's why I think that all teacher colleges should be closed. Okay? Teachers should study in universities, even a kindergarten teacher, and get a degree in chemistry or in literature or in economic history, or in history or whatever. Okay? Get a degree from a university. And then the training to be a teacher in the classroom and the methods, etc., that can be acquired in a year or 18 months or something like that. But teachers should study in regular universities. That's how it is, for example, in Sweden. That's how it is in Finland. There are no teacher colleges. The teacher colleges that exist is only to supplement the education with pedagogical education. And why should a teacher have, a different education? If you want to be a chemistry teacher or you be a math teacher in primary school, you should get a degree in mathematics at the university. You solve several problems with this prescription. First of all, the teacher gets high quality training in the subject matter that he's teaching. But there is one thing which is more important, which I'm stressing in Israel all the time. When you are a chemist by degree, you have an outside option for employment as a teacher. That actually a force that resists eroding the salaries of teachers. Because if your teacher's salary will be reduced, you can, given some retraining, you can become a chemist. You can become a biologist. That's your training. So that's actually forced the system to keep wages of teachers increasing in real terms, whatever. I'm not going to talk about that in a minute, now. But that's a mechanism that I think is very useful for, and also, I don't know if you should be a teacher for 30, 40 years. If you want to, that's fine. But sometimes there are many teachers who are kind of burned and they don't have any energy anymore to be a teacher. If they have a degree in something else, they can renew that knowledge, not very costly, and become something else. Now that life expectancy for male is over 80 years and for female is over 85 years, why should I be a teacher for 50 years if I don't want to be a teacher? If I get general training and I get degrees from a university, I can do something else. I mean, at least it's an option. So I think, to be honest, that's my recommendation in Israel all the time. Of course, it's not accepted. Close all teachers' colleges.
Okay, so this is a question trying to link the beginning and the end of this roundtable. So it goes to George and to Victor, a little bit all together. So there is this kind of tension when we think of human capital and immigration that on the one hand, if you think of immigration, and it was part of the arguments that George was making at the beginning, we tend to think that, well, maybe we should import unskilled immigrants if we become more skilled, just as a complement of the human capital that we have, or the type of workers that we have in the country, right? But on the other hand, when we analyze schooling or human capital, we all kind of imply that we want to push everyone to go to university, and even, parents all want their children to go to university and make it good, right? So it seems that there is kind of a tension here, and I don't know whether you guys think that we should try to put this together in some way or something.
I don't have sure answers, unfortunately, unlike Victor, about anything. Look, my take on immigration is that the distributional consequences are probably far more important than the efficiency gains in the end. Unless there are huge externalities that somebody can come up with in the next few years, I think the debate in every country tends to revolve around distributional consequences for a reason. So to jump from the data to saying anything along the lines that you want to say in terms of what should we do, right? I think you have to ask yourself a different question. Because the data cannot help you. Man cannot live by data alone. There will be a way to say it. The data cannot help you. I would actually go further than that. I would say all the empirical work done in economics on immigration has zero policy implications. Zero. And the reason is that policy implications, despite the sureness with which people talk about education or whatever, really depend on an objective function. That's one thing that being in the Kennedy School taught me. Policy comes from having objective functions informed by data. And almost all of the time, it's the objective function that really determines the answer. So to give you an example with immigration, in terms of the question you asked, if my objective function were to help people all over the world, poor people all over the world, well, the US does that. You saw the high school dropout share going up. The US immigration policy is really the largest anti-poverty program ever known in the universe. For real. And that's fine, if that's what you care about. If what you care about happens to be the disadvantaged minorities in the US, that's a very different care that you have, a very different concern. And what immigration policy should be which hat are you wearing? So my answer to your question in terms of what should we do is, who are you rooting for? You tell me who you root for, I tell you what we should do.
Add something or we conclude?
No, I mean, if I just add, again, something that I emphasized this morning to the journalist, and that's about investment in education, and everybody want to go to universities, etc. Again, I'm kind of very determined about what I'm going to say. I don't think that education system should track students to any type of schooling that will limit their options post age 18, 20. That means that I don't like at all having vocational training done in schools, in public schools, in high school. I don't like the idea of deciding for a 12-year-old kid that he should be a technician, and that's where he should study. So I think education, again, I will emphasize the increased life expectancy. There is no reason whatsoever to close option to students before age 18, 20. Students should study in schools general education, not a profession. That not only the public sector doesn't know how to do it very well, that should be left to the private sector, that should also be left to students after age 18. And I don't think that that will increase the dropout rate. That's the argument that is brought usually. If you don't teach students at this age to be carpenters, they will leave school. Now just look, who are the students who are tracked into studying to be a carpenter or a car mechanics? Those are students who come from low deprived background, and we know that kids develop very much after age 16, 18. So in terms of allowing students to pursue their desires, their ambition to go to university, I would say yes. If that's, I mean, I wouldn't close any option for students. And by not closing options, my recommendation is to close vocational education in public schools, allow the private sector, there are many ways we can do it with vouchers, etc., but basically keep students studying general education. They will be better citizens, they will appreciate more democracy, they will know more history, they will know to read and write by age 18, and then if they want to be technicians, they can be technicians.
Okay. Last question. Then we are going to go for a reception.
Oh, we have a reception.
Sure. After all this talk, come on.
Excuse me, following on what you mentioned about not closing vocational schools. So I'm from Argentina. We closed all vocational schools. We're also technical schools. And we have the problem that we have free university. So people can go to university, but their background just doesn't allow them to do it. So I went to the best free high school. Many classmates, top grades, but they just couldn't go to university because they had to go to work right after school. And it didn't seem like the last 2-3 years of schooling helped them much because they went into the job market knowing a lot of math, knowing a lot of stuff, but they ended up working in jobs that those skills weren't required. So is it probably something that depends on how developed the country is, how unequal the income distribution may be?
You're addressing it to me?
Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, I'm presenting, my point of view very sharply because the world is acting against, in a way, the interest of more than half of the population that is deprived from access to many things that the other half has, okay? And we know from psychology, we know from cognitive development, there are many, many kids who develop later. Not everybody can study playing the piano at age 6, 7, 8, 9. Not only because his parents cannot afford a good teacher and a good piano, but also because some people develop later. So I don't think that kids should be tracked early on to different things. They should be allowed the most flexibility. And when I say most flexibility, once you have vocational schooling in place during high school, those students are doomed to be there because the supply will create the demand. Once you have teachers who are qualified and they teach some occupations, to be a barber, to be a car mechanic, to be whatever, the system will find students to put them there. And I don't want that, okay? I don't want to create the environment that will be tempting for policymakers to put these students in those places. And we don't have time. I believe that there is a way to keep those students in school and study general subjects, reading, writing, mathematics as much as possible. They don't have to go to university afterwards. I will give them a voucher conditional on them staying 12 years in schooling. They will get from me a voucher to study, to be a mechanic from age 18 to 20 in the private sector. Okay? There are mechanisms that can be designed to solve this problem. That's the direction I have in mind.
Very good. Okay, so that's the end of our roundtable. Thanks a lot to participants and everyone.